Thanks once again, Brother James, and good evening, brothers and sisters and young people. Well, we come to the fourth in this series of talks on Jacob's redemption, bringing again of the captivity of Jacob, and tonight we're going to have a look at where we stand in the scheme of things, and hopefully see just how close we are to the return of our Lord Jesus Christ and the beginning of the work of Elijah, and that period of 50 years, which will ultimately see the kingdom of God established upon the earth. You know, brothers and sisters, we can tire at times from the repetitive arguments that are made about how close Christ is to coming. I am often reminded by people in my own ecclesia that in giving classes there in 1979, when my daughter was born, our first child, that I doubted that she would ever go to school. She has 4 children, all of whom are now at school. And so I'm reminded that perhaps I might have been a little premature in the expectation. Well, of course, we know that that is the way God has written the Scripture. He has written it so that every generation suspects that they might see the return of Christ. But one will. And we're going to see tonight that that is going to be us. I want to demonstrate that to you beyond, I believe, all dispute. And you're going to see tonight the evidence for that. Now, I'm not going to tell you tonight that Christ will come in 2011 or 12 or 13 or 14 or 15. But I'm going to put some evidence before you that you can make your own conclusions about it. I will not be speaking of days or hours or even years, but I will be speaking about what the Scripture eloquently sets forth about the demise of the system that we've been speaking about in our studies over the last few nights. And it is very, very clear when that system has to meet its utter end, when it has to be abolished. And it's because of that, and I'll come to that a little later, it's because of that that we are on the cusp of a time of trouble such as never was. And that's the subject matter, isn't it, of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. So let's have a look at this passage that is before us. This time of trouble. We might ask, when? When we read this verse carefully, we notice that in that first verse of Daniel 12 there are 2 identical phrases. It is the phrase, at that time. It's well worth highlighting. It says, and at that time. What time? We just need to step back into chapter 11 and work your way down from verse 40. We know that the first part of verse 40 of Daniel chapter 11 has been fulfilled and was fulfilled in 1917. Because it says there in chapter 11 verse 40, and at that time, at the time of the end, I should say, shall the king of the south push at him. And we know that the him of this passage is the power occupying Constantinople, whoever that might be. And of course, when the British, who were the occupants of Egypt, the king of the south at the time, pushed in the events of the First World War against the Turks, who were the possessors of the land of Palestine, as it was then known, and pushed the Turk out of it, a basis was laid upon which the nation of Israel could subsequently be formed, and was formed in 1948, in events that most of us are quite familiar with. So you see, as far as God was concerned, that was the time of the end. Now it's been a rather long time of the end, hasn't it? But we've got to look at these things from the divine perspective. He doesn't see things as we see them. We are finite creatures. A few days to us is a length of time. To him, 1,000 years is as one day. And so the events of 1917, when the British pushed the Turks out of Palestine, began what he calls the time of the end. And what flows on from that, of course, is the next stage, which is still yet future, when the king of the north, which requires that Russia take possession of the territory once controlled by those who were called kings of the north, that is the Seleucid territory, which consists of Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and a portion of Pakistan today. When Russia has taken control of that area, and they will in the wake of the great economic crash that is looming upon our world, then they can fulfil the second half of verse 40 of Daniel 11 and plunge down upon the land of Israel, passing through Turkey, and with many ships come down into Egypt, down the coastal strip of the land of Israel. And that, of course, ultimately precipitates the events of Armageddon. Because when they return, as Daniel 11 says, back to Jerusalem, and are victorious in the land, and establish the tent of their power between the seas in my glorious holy mountain, says Yahweh, that is when they will be destroyed. Who will destroy them? Well, we know that, Christ and the saints. And so 10 years prior to Armageddon, he will have appeared to accomplish Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And that's why that chapter starts with that phrase, and at that time. It's telling us the era in which these things will be fulfilled. Our time. Later on in the verse it says this, towards the end of verse 1, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So we know the time that he's talking about here. It's the time of Armageddon and the events that precede it now in the preparation of Christ's army. And he's called Michael in this context. It's a statement of fact, not a question. He who is like ale will appear to raise the dead, and the judgment seat will follow. And that will begin, the resurrection will begin 10 years prior to Armageddon. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is when the time of trouble starts. Did you read that verse carefully? So let's read it again. Let's see what this verse is telling us. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered by resurrection. Got it? The time of trouble starts at the resurrection of the dead. Now, I thought that I was one of those who was on an island and that I had seen this and nobody else had seen it before. And I mention this because it's very important for us to understand that a lot of things that are unknown to us were known to brethren who have gone before, which is why it's wise to read reliable Christadelphian writings. And so Brother Mansfield, in the Expositor on Daniel, makes this comment about Daniel 12 verse 1. Concerning this word trouble here. The Hebrew word, he says, for trouble is sarah. It indicates intense turmoil. That's the way it's used in Psalm 25 and verse 17. Comparable to the pain endured by a woman bearing her first child. Jeremiah 4 verse 31. And that's an experience that some will shortly face, bearing their first child. And they will know what this is about. He goes on to say, it describes the terror of a people who cowered in fear before a merciless, rapacious army, as we see in Jeremiah 6 verse 24. And it goes on to mention verses like Habakkuk 3:16, Zephaniah 1:15 and Zechariah 10 and verse 11. And the same word, and this is the point that I wanted to make, the same word appears in Jeremiah 30 verse 7 about the time of Jacob's trouble. And you'll recall every man having his hands upon his loins as though he was bringing forth a child. Remember that? Okay, so that's the nature of this word. It's about that kind of intense pain. But Brother Mansfield goes on to say this. Thus the Lord will return at a time of unparalleled chaos involving both Israel and the Gentiles. He quotes a series of passages. It will be an age of spiritual and moral gloom. We're in that now. With mankind in a state of gross darkness. Isaiah 60 verse 2. Gross darkness because all the light has been taken out. All Christadelphians have been removed. Nobody has the truth anymore. They're all at Sinai. They've been removed. And so the earth is in gross darkness. Well, there are plenty of churches, but it won't have any light. Goes on to say, the trouble will be so intense there will seem to be no way out, as the word perplexity in Luke 21:25 signifies, with men's hearts failing them for fear as they contemplate the catastrophe that faces them. And then finally he says this, the saints, however, have already been removed from this scene of chaos. For the time of trouble will erupt as the judgment seat is in progress. So you see, he saw it long before I saw it. He understood that very well. And when you look at that passage, there's no other way you can really, at the end of the day, come to any different conclusion. And that is very fitting, because when we are removed, brethren and sisters, God will have no reason to maintain peace and order in human society. And he can begin what's described in Isaiah 26 verse 20 as his indignation. Come, my people, hide yourselves for a moment until the indignation be overpassed. So where are the saints in that passage? Well, in the bridal chamber. They've been taken as the bride of Christ. And while he's rejoicing with them, the world outside is in utter chaos. And you're going to see tonight why it will be in utter chaos. There's going to be a cataclysmic collapse of the world's economy. And this is not my idea, as you're going to see. I'm going to stop talking a bit later on, that would be a good thing. I'm going to stop talking and show you some clips that have been downloaded from various American and Australian TV programs as to what is actually going on out there. You know, when you live in the northern parts of Saskatchewan, it may be possible to think that the rest of the world is like you are up here, tranquil. You know, things going along quite swimmingly. Well, I don't know that you swim in this weather, but anyway, going along quite smoothly. Well, it's not like that in the rest of the world, especially down the way in America, where there are effectively 20% unemployed. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just a couple more things about Daniel 12. He goes on to say this after verse 2, verse 3, and they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars for ever and ever. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Now we know when the time of the end was. It's that one back in chapter 11 verse 40. Okay? So it's been around for a while. So what would happen at this period of the time of the end to a book that had been shut up and sealed, that is not properly understood, not understood in its fullest extent? Well, it would become better known, better understood. That's what he means here. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now, I guess most of you would probably have heard that this is a reference to the way in which the world has gone crazy. You know, people are buzzing all over the place. There are globetrotters who appear from Australia all the time, and from the UK, and they're buzzing all over the place, aren't they? And you know, there's 50,000 aircraft over North America every second of the day. I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? Not about that. It's not about the exponential extension of knowledge and all the computer age that we live in. It's not about that. And the verse tells you that. Read it again, verse 4. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words. What does that mean? If they're shut up, seal the book. It means people don't understand them. We know this from Isaiah 29. They gave to the book the priest. He said, "Oh, I can't open that. It's shut. It's sealed." See, the priest didn't have any clue what was in it, and it was his responsibility, says Malachi 2 verse 7, to have understanding. His lips should keep knowledge. He's a teacher. Give him the book. No, it's sealed. It's shut up. So this is about ignorance. It's about people who don't understand. It's about a limitation imposed by a lack of hindsight. And we've got a lot of hindsight where we stand. And that's why there has been an explosion of knowledge in the last 100 or so years in our community. But not everybody's got it. And why don't they get it? See what it says here in verse 4? Many shall run to and fro. And as you've had time to read the screen, Josenius says the word shoot, as it's rendered, shoot, is used metaphorically to run through a book. That is, to examine thoroughly. So there's going to be people at the time of the end who will become very effective Bible students, and they will know their Bible prophecy. They will know the times in which they live. They will see the hand of God at work, and they will be able, hopefully, to help others to see it. That's what verse 3 is about, isn't it? Rotherham translates the early part of verse 3, and they who make wise. They who make wise, and they that turn many to righteousness shall shine as the stars forever. We've all got a responsibility in that regard. If you have children, that's your responsibility. If you're in the ecclesia, you've got young people, you've got a huge responsibility. If you are a leader in the ecclesia in any form, whether it be as a Sunday school teacher or as an AB or as a Bible class leader or an exhorter, you have a huge responsibility. You know what it is? To run through the book and to understand it and to open it up, because this is what's going to happen if you don't. Verse 10. Many shall be purified and made white. That's the positive effect of running through the book. And try that the lawless shall do lawless. Why are they lawless? Because they haven't been running through the book. And it says, but the wise shall understand. That takes you back to verses 3 and 4. So this is about becoming effective Bible students. And there's never been a generation of Christadelphians who have the amount of helps that we have to understand the Bible. Never. You know, you've got everything today. You've got the Christadelphian bookshelf, which provides you access to books that have been out of print for 500 years. And certainly in the Brotherhood, a lot of the books there are simply not obtainable today. But you can get them and you can search them. So we've got access to understanding the Bible in a way that people of previous generations have never had. How many people are using it? How many people are really effectively using it? That's the exhortation we should take from Daniel chapter 12. This is supposed to be a time when many would run to and fro through the book and come to an understanding of it, and be teachers of it. And we need more of them in our brotherhood today. Brother Mansfield goes on to say this. He makes mention of the fact that there would be an increase of knowledge in society generally and people would be buzzing about. But then he says this. It is nevertheless true also that the scriptures have been opened up to a greater extent than formerly. Printed expositions and commentaries abound. And the passage of history has verified most prophetic details. Yet there is a lack of true understanding. And we should take the exhortation from that. Now, having had that as an introduction in Daniel chapter 12, I want to now take you to the next step. I'm going to talk about this theme. Now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob. I just want to alert you to verse 7 of Daniel 12 before I talk about Daniel 9:2. Daniel 12 verse 7, we read this. Daniel watches the two angels beside the bank of the river. And he heard the man clothed in linen. Now this is the man of chapter 10. The man of the one of Daniel chapter 10, of which Daniel is a part. So the glorified Christ is there in symbol. And he hears this. He raised his right hand and he swore by him that liveth forever. That's quoted in Revelation chapter 10, verses 5 to 7. Concerning the mighty rainbowed angel. Remember? He's enveloped with a cloud. So the multitudinous Christ is here. We know that. And then it says this, at the end of verse 7, and it shall be for a time, times and a half. And we're going to see that that refers to 1260 years. And we're going to see where that terminates. Because it terminates in the same place, in the same year, as the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8 that we're going to have a look at tonight. a little later in this talk. We're going to see that the demise of the papal system is in the same era as the redemption of Jacob. That when Elijah has finally got that people back to the borders of the land, they will have destroyed, in the course of their second exodus, the power of the papacy and the nations that support it. It's in exactly the same era that those two things occur. And we're going to put a year on that. We're going to put a date on that in a moment. And why shouldn't we look for dates? Daniel did. And we read in Daniel chapter 9 verse 2 these words. In the first year of Darius' reign, he says, I, Daniel, by books, understood by books. What was he doing, do you think? He was running to and fro through the book, the only book that really matters. And he understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Of course, he has in mind Jeremiah 29, which told the people who went into captivity that they would be there for 70 years. It also told them that a different period of 70 years would apply to their temple. So the first captivity went away in 606 BC, and they returned in 536, exactly 70 years later. The temple's destroyed in 587 BC, and it wasn't finally built until 517, exactly 70 years later. And there were other time periods as well. So Daniel ran to and fro through the book, and he came to understand when it was that his people would return. And he knew the year. It was 536 BC, and God allowed him to live until that year, and then gave him this final vision from chapter 10 to chapter 12 and says, Daniel, I'll put you through a symbolic death, resurrection, judgment seat and glorification, and tell you what I'm going to do to your people, and then I'll let you go. You can close the book until there comes a time when people will run to and fro through it and fully understand it. And then will come the time of the resurrection, and you will stand in your lot at the end of the days. And Daniel is about to see the light of day again. It will not be very long, and he will see the light of day again and receive his reward. The only question is, will we receive ours alongside of him? But that's where we stand. Now, if Daniel was looking for a period when he could be sure, why shouldn't we? There is one. We can't put a day, hour, month, year on when we will be taken, but we can put a year on when the papal system has to be destroyed. And it's the same year in which Elijah will have redeemed all of the Jews and brought them to the end of the second exodus of Israel. Now, you've had time to absorb that chart. Many of you have seen this before, some quite often. However, it's very important to have the framework, the structure in our minds. We have the resurrection of the dead, when Daniel will be raised along with all those who are responsible. We have the 12-month period of the judgment seat of Christ. We have the marriage of the Lamb, the first year of which, of course, will be when Christ rejoices with his bride and meets every one of them personally. And then he will prepare them for the work that they are to do. And 3.5 years before Armageddon, most likely, he will send forth Elijah and many of those saints to begin the process of warning the Jews scattered throughout the world, not in the land, the ones outside, in the nations, that they will receive in due time the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. We spoke about that in our first session, remember? Okay, Armageddon will eventually come. Not before certain other things happen. The work of subduing the Sinaitic Arabs has to start before Armageddon. The work of smiting and healing Egypt starts before Armageddon. So there are many things that have to be done. That's why Christ has to come 10 years before, to prepare his people for the work that they will share with him. But when Armageddon does come, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven will have been revealed. And of course the Jews who are scattered throughout all parts of the earth will then make their way to the areas where Elijah will require them to board ships, to take a course, a path that will lead them to the wilderness of the peoples. And by the time they get there, Rome and its supporting nations will be in full rebellion against the rule of our Lord Jesus Christ. He will establish the throne immediately after Armageddon. He will begin the work of redeeming the people, the third who survive in the land. He will bury the forces of Gog. He will send forth many saints in the mid-heaven proclamation. But meanwhile, while this is all going on, and while he's laying the foundations of the temple, and other nations, sensible nations like Britain and Australia and Canada, are submitting to Christ's rule, the nations of Catholic Europe will be gathering behind the Pope, and they will be setting out to overthrow his rule in Jerusalem. And Elijah will have, by this time, finally brought the Jews in the second Exodus and locked them in Europe somewhere in this period, just in time to bring this 30-year period of judgment, the hour of judgment upon Catholic Europe. We've talked about that in our last few studies, so you can see the relationship of this one to what we've already done. And when the work of destroying the harlot has been accomplished, when the harlot has been revealed to the world for what she truly is, Christ will finally reveal his bride to the world. This is what Zechariah 14 verses 6 and 7 is about, isn't it? You know what it says? That the bright ones will draw in, but at the evening time they will be revealed. That's what that's about. The saints will do their work, a lot of it, unseen by the power of the nations, unseen by men. Some of it they will be seen, but most of it, no, they will not be seen, and certainly their glory will not be shown. They will turn up like the angels turned up to Abraham, appear like ordinary men. That's why the Catholic nations of Europe will spit in their face. Who are you to come making these demands to us? But the time will come when the Catholic harlot has been destroyed, that Christ will reveal his bride to the world, and he will call every single member of it back to Jerusalem, into the house of prayer that is now almost fully ready for use. And there, with the nations who have submitted to him, he will show his bride to the world, and he will hold the marriage supper of the Lamb. Blessed are they that come and participate in the marriage supper of the Lamb, just like the weddings we have nowadays, isn't it? You know, you have a wedding ceremony, and several hours later you might get a meal. That's what it's like. So you have the marriage back here, and you have the meal down here. Okay? 40 odd years later, more than 40 years later. And so, brothers and sisters, that will be concomitant with another major event. And that major event is that the papacy will have been abolished by the year 2060. It will never, ever be heard of again. Beyond the year 2060, you will not find a Roman Catholic on earth. You will not find anyone that would call themselves a pope. Nimrod will have been destroyed, gone forever. How do we know? How can we be so dogmatic? Well, because that's what the Bible teaches. So let's have a look at it. It teaches that. Now, you've seen this chart before, haven't you? I'm putting it up because I want you to come with me to Daniel chapter 7 and to see that this downward line here, which refers to Revelation chapter 19 and verse 20, when the beast and the false prophet are finally destroyed towards the end of this 40 years, when the second Exodus is almost over, when that event occurs, that will be in the year 2060. How do we know that? Daniel chapter 7. We come back to verse 7 and 8 of this chapter. Now we know that verse 7 is about the fourth beast, the Roman beast. We could say a little bit about what it has yet to accomplish, about the stamping of the residue with its feet. We don't have time for that tonight. But we do know this, that this fourth beast of Rome had 10 horns. That is, the 10 nations formed by barbarian invasions that broke up the Roman Empire over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Those 10 horns will appear again very shortly. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. He says this though in verse 8. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. When does this horn, which by the way speaks of the rise of the Holy Roman Empire in the West, when will this horn meet its demise? Well, we're told that in verse 25. It says in verse 25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, that is with the mouth that was in the horn of verse 8. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High and think to change times and laws. So the mouth of this horn is the horn that issues encyclicals. Yeah, it's the mouth that speaks encyclicals, changing times and laws as the Catholic system has done down through the centuries. And they shall be given into his hand, that is, those who oppose him, the political witness, the religious witness. They're the saints referred to here, not just Christadelphians, but all of those who oppose this system. He will wear them out. For how long? Until the time and times and the dividing of time. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to find, of course, as you well know, that that's 1260 years. And we will see how significant that is in relation to the year 2060. Now, during this period of 40 years, the European nations will have rebuilt the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire is the subject of Daniel chapter 7, verse 8 onwards. Whereas chapter 8 of Daniel deals with the power inhabiting Constantinople. You should always remember, this is for the younger people in our midst. If you want to do something useful, right above Daniel chapter 7, that this is about the West. Daniel 7 is about the Western Empire, and Daniel 8 is about the Eastern Empire. And there are two horns involved here. You've got a little horn here in chapter 7, verse 8, which is the Holy Roman Empire, which was established in the West. And in chapter 8, you have a little horn, the little horn of the goat. Now you can confuse these. They're totally different. The little horn of the goat of chapter 8 is the power inhabiting Constantinople. That's in the East. Okay? So when you come to this chapter, you're talking about what went on in the West of the Roman Empire. And it's about the Holy Roman Empire, which they are rebuilding in the West today. That's what we're going to see. So, brothers and sisters, was this prophecy ever understood? Well, yes, it was. It was understood by Sir Isaac Newton. He knew this date, 2060. And they found that when they found his private papers that he had very carefully hidden. Because if his private papers had got into the hands of the church, he would have been excommunicated and probably have met the fate of Pope John Paul I. It was poisoned by a cardinal to get rid of him. They would have hated him if they knew that he wrote in his private papers that the papal system would meet its demise by 2060. So who was Sir Isaac Newton? Well, he lived from 1642 to 1727. He was a noted mathematician and physicist, perhaps one of the foremost scientific intellects of all time. He wrote on religion extensively. He rejected the Trinity, which wouldn't have made him popular in the church. He saw it as unscriptural, and he predicted 2060 as the year of the demise of the papacy. And they found his private papers in recent times which indicated that fact. So you might ask, well, why didn't Brother Thomas talk about this in exposition of Daniel? Well, I don't think there's any doubt at all that Brother Thomas did in his time what we will do tonight. And when he came up with the obvious conclusion that the papacy would be destroyed in 2060, and he is writing the exposition of Daniel in 1854, he would have said, well, no, there's no way. There's just no way that it could be that far away. 200 plus years. No. Now, put that one aside. That's in the too hard basket. But what about when you're living in 2011? It's not in the too hard basket then, is it? So what about this prophecy? Let's have a look at what Daniel 7 verse 8 is saying. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up. So here is our 3 have been replaced. 10 horns on the fourth Roman beast, okay? These are the barbarian powers that were established by invading the Roman Empire. 3 of them were plucked up by the roots and replaced by this little horn with this gentleman with eyes and a mouth. It's the Holy Roman Empire speaking great things against the Most High. Now, how did this come about? Well, the papacy fell out with the Eastern emperors in Constantinople in the 7th century over all things idolatry. Because the Eastern emperors decided that idols had to be thrown away, and the Pope said, well, there's no way I'm getting rid of my idols. So they said to him, well, you can row your own canoe then. We're not going to support you anymore. We will not send our armies to protect you from the barbarians. Goodbye. And so the barbarians, particularly in northern Italy, and there were 3 Lombard nations formed in northern Italy, made life very difficult for the Pope for 40 or 50 years, until he got sick of it. He kept on appealing for help from the east. He said, jump in the lake. Not interested. So finally he had to go to the King of France, Pepin. And he called on him to come down and help him. In the early 750s AD, Pepin came down in several campaigns over several years. He finally defeated those 3 Lombard states. And in 758, he formally gave those 3 Lombard states to the Pope, who immediately produced a triple tiara crown. You've seen that in the Pope, haven't you? The triple tiara crown, you see it's got the 3 parts to it. That's because he'd been given these 3 states, 3 horns. Barbarian states in northern Italy had been plucked up by the roots and given to the Pope. They became his territory. He was now a political entity with power that he could rule over these. There were no longer 3 states, there were only 1. And it was to expand, and by 800 AD that had become the Holy Roman Empire. And the son of Pepin, Charles the Great, called Charlemagne, finally was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD by Pope Leo III in the Vatican. And you have someone here who's drawn a picture of that, see? Here's Pope Leo crowning Charlemagne. And that was on Christmas Day. They can choose their days pretty well, can't they? Christmas Day, 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor. And that's when the Holy Roman Empire came into existence. That's when this horn we've been reading about in verse 8 finally came into its existence with eyes and a mouth. It's the Revelation 13 beast of the earth. You know, that lamb-like creature, which means it's a religious power, with a lion-like mouth, which means it's savage. The 2 horns on its head, one is the emperor and one is the pope. That's the power of the Holy Roman Empire. It came into existence in 800 AD. And the nations of the world know that. And in fact, Europe is rebuilding it. This book here, The Principality and Power of Europe, Britain and the Emerging Holy Roman Empire, is about 15 years old. So they've been working on this for a long, long time. And the Bible says they would. They would rebuild the Holy Roman Empire, because this is the power that Christ destroys. The 4th beast is utterly destroyed. Have a look at Daniel chapter 7 verse 11. I beheld then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. Got it? The horn spake, which means that the Holy Roman Empire is going to exist and Christ will destroy it. It says this in verse 11. I beheld even till the beast was slain. This is the 4th beast of verse 7, the Roman power, which has to be restored in all its glory. And it says his body was destroyed and given to the burning flame. In other words, it's utterly abolished. So you've got the beast, the 4th beast of Daniel 7, the Roman Empire, with this little horn. It's in existence. And Christ comes and destroys that power and burns its body. That's your job, by the way, and hopefully mine. And you see, they're rebuilding that today before our very eyes. You know, when the French minted their euro coin, They're not mugs, are they? They knew what they were doing. They put the visage of Charlemagne on the back of their coin. And they had two dates here. Over on the other side, which you can't see, was 800 AD. On this side is 814 when he died. Now, he had been king for decades. He came after his father, Pepin, as king of France. They don't make any mention of that. They only make mention of the year 800. Because you see, what they're signalling is this fact, that what they are rebuilding is the Holy Roman Empire. And it came into existence in 800 AD. Who cares about the 770s or the 780s when Charlemagne went all over Europe, capturing and conquering? Who cares about that? They're only concerned about 800. And so's God. That's all he's concerned about in Daniel chapter 7. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at this section in verses 23 to 26. Because you don't have to really argue about this, because you're given the interpretation. It's simple. You just read it. We're not going to read verse 23 because we've talked about that story. Or verse 24, the 10 horns, 3 of whom are plucked up. We know what that means. And verse 25 we've read. Just come to the end of verse 25 again. And they shall be given into his hand. That is, he will wear out the opposition until a time and times and the dividing of time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. So there is an end. It's the terminus of this period of the times and dividing of time. And this is taking us back to the earlier verses of Daniel chapter 7. So who does this work? Verse 27. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. The people of the saints of the Most High here is clearly, if you consider the context carefully, it's clearly those who will rule in the kingdom. It's the saints who will rule alongside of the Lord Jesus Christ for 1,000 years. They're the ones who take possession of the kingdom. Israel will be the first dominion, to be sure. They will be redeemed, to be sure. But long before the bulk of Israel get back into that land and take their possession, the saints will have been ruling with Christ, and they will finish off the opposition. The opposition being the Catholic nations of Europe who have risen up against him. So what about this times, and the dividing of time? It's nice to be talking to an audience that has had experience of these things, because it's not going to be new to you. It is, of course, a period of 1,260 days, and we spoke about that last evening. Very significant, isn't it? Very significant. This period should keep popping up in Bible prophecy. But it's not by accident. Now, a Jewish year has 360 days in it. That's why the Jews, of course, have to have a 13th month every 7 or so years to catch up with the rest of us. All right? Because we've got 365 and sometimes a bit more. Well, thereabouts. So 360 days. If that's a time, there it is, the time 360. Times means 2 of them, 720. And a dividing of time means a half, that is 180. You add that up, you get 1,260 days, and using, of course, as God frequently does, the principle of a day for a year. We have a period of 1,260 years. So does this work in history? Yes, it does. When Constantine defeated Maxentius, as we spoke about the other day, in Revelation chapter 11, when he came to power with the support and assistance of the apostate church, you add 1,260 years to AD 312, you come to 1572. And in August of that year was the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, when the witnesses were put to death in France. You come to the period of 529 to 533 AD, a very important era in relation to the development of papal power. Justinian, the Eastern Emperor, sitting in Constantinople, wrote many decrees. He called them the Decretals. And there were many of them. That's why it took him several years to lay them out. And those decrees gave the Bishop of Rome headship of the church, effectively political power in the West. So you add your 1,260 years. to 529 and 533. And you come to 1789 and 1793. The French Revolution began in 1789. It was at its height in 1793. And it saw the loss of papal control of the eldest son of the church, that is France. And effectively throughout Europe, the Pope had his hands cut off. So the decrees that Justinian issued to him to give him political power in the West came to an end 1260 years later. Another very important date in the history of the development of papal power is 608 to 610, when a grubby little centurion came to power on the throne in Constantinople. He shouldn't have been there. He should not have been there, but God put him there. Because you see, prophecy is the mould into which history is poured. And so God puts the people he needs in power at the time he needs them. So this grubby little man called Phocas came to power in the east. And what did he do? 608 to 610, he issued decrees. Unbelievable decrees. There was much rejoicing in the Vatican because this set of decrees granted the papacy what is called temporal power. Now, temporal power effectively means political power over people and land. Okay? So he said, basically, the West is yours. Cool, you beauty. And away the papacy went, and by 1200 AD there was not a power on earth that could challenge him. Not even the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire could challenge him. He had one emperor stand outside in the winter snows, waiting for an audience. And he left him out there to freeze, showing that he was the dominant power on earth, and he was. There was nobody who stood against the papacy by 1200 AD. It all began back here with Phocas, the decrees that he gave. But you add 1260 to these dates, and you come to 1868 and to 1870. And Brother Thomas, of course, who died in 1871, saw this as a remarkable fulfilment of Bible prophecy, because Garibaldi drove the Pope out of the Vatican, and he lost his temporal power. And by the way, he responded in 1869 by calling the First Vatican Council and declaring himself infallible when speaking ex cathedra. So there was a blow. He had a punch back. But he was effectively put out of business. He lost his temporal power for some time. So you see, it works. And in fact, if you have a look at any major development in the rise and development of papal power in history, guess what? Add 1260 to it. And every single time it's reversed. Every one. Accident? No. God is saying to us, you got it. I don't mess around. I work in periods of 1260. That's half a week. It's half of 2520, the Daniel 4 number. Got it? That's what he's saying. And if we don't get it, well then we are going to be bereft of one of the greatest signs that we're on the very cusp of the return of Christ. Because the times of the Holy Roman Empire are well known. People say, oh, but the calendar's all wonky. Yeah, of course. It's the Gregorian calendar, developed by Pope Gregory the 13th. 13, number of rebellion. Got to be wonky, doesn't it? No. It might be a wonky calendar, but so's the Jewish. Okay? The fact is that these dates, whether they're wonky or not, you add 1260 to them and it works every time because you're working in the same calendar. So don't make that as an excuse. These are the dates of the Holy Roman Empire. 758, Pepin, King of France, conquered 3 barbarian states in Italy and gave them to the Pope. He creates his triple tiara crown. In 800 AD, Pope Leo crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. You add your 1260 years to those 2 dates and this is what you get. 758 plus 1260 is 2018. And you always get the reverse. Now, you might think that 758 was a time of great glory and honour for the papacy, to be given 3 states. In fact, the Pope was humiliated. He had to call upon a European emperor to come and save him from barbarians. And while he was very thankful to be relieved and to be given the 3 states, it was a humiliation for him. Reverse it in 1260 years. And shortly, when the big bus comes, the European nations will look to the Pope to save them from their embarrassment. And that'll happen by 2018, at the very latest. 800 AD is the date of the formation of the HRE. You don't get 1260, and that's why Sir Isaac Newton said that's when the papacy has to come to an end. And it will. It never fails. So I know that 2060 is the date when Mr. Pope goes down the gurgler for good. I know that. And given that fact, and given that we know that there's a Jubilee period, we think we're right on that. That's very telling, isn't it? Now I want to explain to you how this works. The one thing we don't know, and it's a good thing we don't know it, is how long it will be between the actual destruction of the papacy and then the revelation of the bride and the marriage supper and the time when Christ will have universal rule over all nations. We don't know how long that period is. Is it weeks? Probably not. Is it months? I don't know. Is it a year? Don't know. Is it 2? And so on. But I don't think it can be all that long. And what it turns out to be, that's what it will be. But if you take 50 years of 2060, you get 2010. If you add on to 2060, whatever that period is between the destruction of the papal system and Christ finally declaring that he's in total control of the earth and every knee on earth bows to him, you add that period on, and that's got to be added on to 2010. If that happens to be 1 year, well, it'll be 2011. If it happens to be 2 years, it'll be 2012. If it happens to be 3 years, you got it. So I'm not telling you what year Christ is going to come. And don't let me hear that be said, because I'll be writing to you. But what I am telling you is that we ain't got long. And that's pretty obvious to any intelligent mind. We haven't got long. Because that system has to go by 2060. So if 2060 is a terminus date, less than a Jubilee away, how far can we be from this time of trouble? Or not far, we're going to see. And if our removal is the signal for very hard times to fall upon our earth, what will it be like before we are taken? I want you to come to Luke 17. Now, many of you have heard me talk about this before. Some may not have. It's important that we know what the Lord is saying here so that we can interpret the signs around us. Luke 17, in this context, from verses 20 to 37, we know, brothers and sisters, is the Lord's warning to us. Whatever application it had to AD 70, it did have an application to AD 70, its primary application is to us. You know why? Because the days of AD 66 to 70 were not times of prosperity. In fact, before Jerusalem fell, people were eating dead bodies. Nobody's going to tell me that that's a time of prosperity. I've not heard of anyone in North Battleford picking up deers from the side of the road. Maybe they do. It's a time of prosperity that we're taking. It wasn't prosperous in AD 66 to AD 70. Now, most of you, I guess, have heard that in this context, from verse 20 to 37, you have the term day or days used 10 times. It's there 5 times in the plural and 5 times in the singular. And it's there for a reason. The plural days refers to days of opportunity. That's why it says in verse 26, and as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. God gave them 120 years in the days of Noah. They were days of opportunity. You either helped Noah build the ark and got in it, or you perished. You just enjoyed the prosperity and you perished because it came to an end. Days of opportunity. Could be time of grace if you use it wisely. But there comes a day, and that word also occurs singular 5 times, because for many, or at least for some, that also will be a day of grace. For others it will be a disaster, like Lot's wife. So we need to take the exhortation from this. These are days of opportunity, the days of Noah, and the days of Lot, and the days of the Son of Man, and we're effectively in the days of the Son of Man now, because he's about to appear to bring divine judgments. So what's it going to be like in these last days? Why does he choose the days of Noah and the days of Lot? Why doesn't he choose the time of the end of Judah under Zedekiah? Well, there was famine. There wasn't prosperity. The only 2 periods that he could have drawn upon, if he wanted to talk about times of prosperity, were the times of Noah and the times of Lot. And that's why he does it. Because he wants us to know, brethren and sisters, that we will be taken in times of prosperity. I know people say, but what about our African brethren? Been to Africa? Have you? There's McDonald's on every corner. You've been to Australia? I've been to North America. And I know what it was like when I was a 10-year-old. And I'm telling you, we're living in times of prosperity. Some of you haven't got a job, maybe. Certainly in America, when I talk to people, they say, oh, I haven't got a job. I noticed you went to a restaurant the other night. You find a way. And whether we are personally suffering or not, generally speaking, taken as a whole, we are in times of unbelievable prosperity. But they're not going to last. Because they didn't last in the days of Noah and of Lot. So what was the problem in the days of Lot? Fullness of bread, abundance of idleness. They were hoarding. Of course, fullness of bread, prosperity, invariably breeds immorality. And it did. So what do they do? Now there are 9 phrases used here in Luke 17, 27 to 28 about their activities. The verbs are in the plural number and the imperfect tense, the active voice, as you would expect. The imperfect tense describes an action which has begun, is in progress, but is not yet completed. So if you want a literal translation, it would be this. They were eating, but they were interrupted. All of a sudden, and you get to the end. They've begun, but it was cut off in its prime. Hence you've got a multitude who are found actively preoccupied in a range of self-seeking activities. And what were they? Well, they were eating, they were drinking, they were married wives, they were given in marriage. Eating and drinking, gluttony and excessive drinking, a culture of enjoyment and revelry. Marrying and being given in marriage, implying that multiple marriages would be the order of the day. A culture of pleasure. Buying and selling, preoccupation with materialism. Planting, the culture of gain. Building, luxury and comfort. Are those things part and parcel of our society? Of course they are. And we're all to some extent involved in them. But it's about to disappear. And I want you to see why. Now this man, George Bush, is long since gone into history, and probably some say, well and good. In his final years, Bush ran over $500 billion deficits in America. He's been far outstripped by President Obama, who in his 2 years of office has run over $1 trillion deficits. Now, a billion, of course, is 1,000 million. Wouldn't be bad to have a small fraction of that, I guess, as your retirement fund. And $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. And the American deficit right now, what it owes the rest of the world is $14 trillion. So a catastrophic crash looms. And government policies are going to contribute to that. Numerous European states, as you know, are on the verge of bankruptcy. And many prosperous nations like Canada and Australia are running what we call two-speed economies. You know, parts of the economy are going okay. Mining industry in Australia, building, no, not so good. It's like that in Canada, isn't it? You've got plenty of oil in this area, or at least to your west. So you get prosperity. Go elsewhere and find out. There's two-speed economy, even in Canada.
Gold prices have increased from $925 per ounce to over $1,150 per ounce, while silver has increased from $14 per ounce to over $18 per ounce. The rise in the price of gold and silver is a result of the major monetary inflation being created by the Federal Reserve, which has held interest rates at 0% for almost a full year. Under the false pretenses of trying to get our phony economy to recover, the Federal Reserve is giving trillions of dollars away for free to bankers on Wall Street at the expense of the American middle class, who will soon see the purchasing power of their savings disappear. The false strength of our phony economy has become dependent on easy money and cheap credit from the Federal Reserve. The longer the Federal Reserve waits to raise interest rates, the greater the chances that our economy will overdose on excess liquidity.
It's sort of like trying to get somebody off drugs. You know, what you're talking about, you don't want the withdrawal symptoms, and I admit there will be withdrawal symptoms. But keeping them on the drug, which is easy money, easy spending, and huge deficits and all that, that'll kill the patient. And the patient, for me, is the dollar, and we're going to be on the verge of killing the patient. And when you see gold up at $1,100 an ounce, that's a little bit of a warning sign. If we keep interest rates artificially low, we're going to destroy the currency. We're going to be talking about, gold not just going up, to $25 in a day, but $50, $100 in a day, $1,000 in a day.
So what next for the dollar? We're going to see in a moment. I'm just going to give you some brief clips like that so you get a bit of a feel for what I'm going to do. Because I don't want to stand here and tell you that the crash is coming. I want these guys to do that. They're not Bible students. They're observers of what's happening. And that Peter Schiff you just heard there, he has predicted every crash since 1987 in the year and the month that it occurred. So he's no donkey when it comes to economic forecasting. That's why he owns no property in America. That's why he rents. That's why all of his money is not in American banks. It's in Scandinavian banks. That's why most of these holdings are in gold. He's no donkey. He knows what's going to happen. And you'll hear, not only him, you'll hear many others. Now, we've seen this before, haven't we? Timeline of depressions. We've got history to look back on. 1929, October, stock market crash. 1930, depression. 25%, 30% unemployment in the US and around the world. Took them 10 years to dig themselves out of that deep hole, and then only by a war, World War II, some of which will be remembered by some in this audience. It wasn't a very nice experience, 60 million people perishing, including 10% of them Jews. Well, what about our times? I'm not going to put a figure on it. I'm not going to say it's 2011, 12, I don't know. I know oil prices will hit by 2012 because they're saying it will. But when it does, we have to be removed, because there's absolutely no way, brothers and sisters, that we could ever go back through a cycle of prosperity again. There's no way we can dig ourselves out of that hole, and it'll be the deepest hole ever in history, get back to prosperity. You know why? Because there won't be any oil, and it's oil that's produced the prosperity of the last 60 or 70 years. And without that, there is no prosperity. And so, this is the last cycle. And we have to go while it's still prosperous, while people have still got bags of money. Buying and selling and building and planting and marrying and giving in marriage. Can't do that in depressions. They didn't do that back here. Okay? And you have to have a war to get out of it. You reckon we have another world war? It's not Armageddon? Come on.
We are on the precipice of a major economic financial collapse. I mean, what we've just experienced, I mean, that's just the opening act. I mean, the real collapse is coming.
One stimulus package will lead to the next one and to more money printing. And so in 5 to 10 years' time, the real crisis will break out when the whole system collapses. That will be the end.
Eventually, this dollar's going to quit working, and then everybody's going to know what poverty is all about. Our politicians need to understand why. Why the country is in this shape? It's because of them. It's because of the Federal Reserve and their policies, their regulations that have distorted the free market and that have created this mess. And that if they don't stop doing what they're doing, there's going to be no turning back.
As the fiscal deficit goes up, the interest payments on the government's debt also go up. They're now around $400 billion annually. I would think that they'll be around $1 trillion in 5 to 7 years' time.
Can you talk to us about the deficit? Are you worried? Should this be a near-term priority?
Everybody ought to be worried about the deficit. It's a big deficit, but the time will come to deal with it.
And so then the government goes bust, but before it does that, it will inflate its way out, or try to inflate its way out. And that won't work. So the next step will be to go to war. The whole thing will collapse.
What comes next? War. I mean, history shows it, and they know the patterns being followed. Now, Brother Thomas once wrote, "Whom God wishes to destroy, he first infatuates." That means he turns them mad. And the world's acting like they're mad. Even the people that put in positions of great responsibility, they're mad, the things that they're doing. And the US particularly is quite bewitched by its own historical power and its sense of invincibility. A household or a business run on the same policies would now be bankrupt. That's the next step, bankruptcy.
The U.S. national debt just surpassed $12 trillion, and the U.S. government itself is estimating a $9 trillion budget deficit over the next 10 years. If the U.S. government was a publicly traded company, it would be bankrupt and its stock price would be zero. It's only a matter of time before the decline in the U.S. dollar we are seeing today becomes a rout and the dollar returns to its intrinsic value of zero.
From what I read and from what I see, there's no intention whatsoever of U.S. policymakers to do anything to stabilize the dollar. They'll continue to print money, and I think long term, my end value for the dollar is zero.
While they see it as a remote possibility, their big concern for the moment is the potential for a disorderly decline in the dollar, which they describe as a momentum-led sell-off where the market would become untethered from fundamentals. In that event, officials say they have contingency plans of what they would say and do.
The Federal Reserve is nothing more than a counterfeiting operation. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, 95 cents of every dollar saved by Americans has been stolen. Some might consider the Federal Reserve to be unconstitutional and this dilution of savings to be a crime. Yet there is still no widespread outrage about it.
This is not new. This is historic. The king in the old days always had control of the money. They did it in different ways. They clipped coins, diluted the metal, printed money. Today, it's really sophisticated. It's done secretly with a computer, and that's why it's made it so much more dangerous than ever before.
So who got the money? To financial institutions in Europe and other countries?
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
The loan went to the loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
Bernanke is not doing a good job. He's doing a horrific job. He's doing, about as bad a job as you could do. I mean, maybe it's possible there's somebody who can do a worse job. I mean, I don't know for sure, but there might be.
Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke recently said that the U.S. should cut down on its budget deficit in order to reduce global imbalances. This is hypocritical, as it's Bernanke who is allowing the U.S. to have such huge budget deficits by monetizing our government spending. Bernanke is the only person with the power to put a stop to this madness. But in his campaign to get reappointed, he most likely promised everyone in Washington that he would continue monetizing their spending into the future.
Isn't it? God puts the right people in power. But you notice China comes into the picture, and China is bankrupting America, if not the rest of the world. Because of places, things like Walmart, they sell Chinese goods. They're not manufactured in North America, are they? That's just one example. And the world economy depends on the Chinese economy for its prosperity. The US certainly depends on China to prop up its national debt. The Chinese government has for many years been buying up US Treasury bonds. They've slowed that markedly. They don't want any more US Treasury bonds because they don't think they'll get repaid. That's the linchpin to sustaining the financing of US debt. In response, the US is now doing what they call quantitative easing. It means printing money. Just printing money. That lasts about 18 months and then you get 30,000% inflation as a result. Can't go on. What about China?
In 10 years' time, in my opinion, about 50% of tax revenues will be used to just cover the interest payments on the government debt. And that is unsustainable, and you really are forced to print money.
Have you ever looked around your house to see where the products inside of it were made? Most likely, 90% of them were made in China. How could the US have the biggest economy in the world if so few of what we own is made here? The US's biggest export is inflation. Because of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, we can just print the money to purchase the goods we consume. However, the world is now looking to move away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
You know, this should be front story on the evening news every night. This is a big thing. Our credit card is about to be taken away. I mean, the reason that this country has been able to survive all these years is because we can print money instead of making stuff.
It is the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency and the fact that foreign nations are forced to trade oil and other commodities in US dollars that has kept the US economy propped up until now. Recent reports indicate that Saudi states are meeting with countries like China and Japan in order to end dollar-based oil transactions and begin transacting oil using a new basket of currencies. To further their move away from the US dollar, China's Ministry of Finance recently announced plans to sell billions worth of 2-year, 3-year, and 5-year yuan-denominated bonds in Hong Kong. Shockingly, over the past 3 months, foreign central banks have put 63% of their new cash purchases into euros and yen, and not into the US dollar. The US dollar still accounts for 62% of the world's foreign currency reserves at foreign central banks. But for how long? India just purchased 200 metric tons of gold from the IMF for $6.7 billion in order to diversify their reserves away from the US dollar. How low will the US dollar fall, and how high will gold rise when more central banks diversify out of dollars and into gold? Despite China boosting its gold reserves by 76% since 2003, gold still only accounts for 1.5% of China's foreign currency reserves. Yet, China still owns $1.6 trillion in US dollar reserves. Most telling of all, China is now encouraging their citizens to invest in silver and will be offering silver for sale at banks in China.
Getting a bit of a feel for what's everything seems prosperous, doesn't it? Life goes on. All things continue as they were from the beginning, said Peter. That some people would say. Some might even say, where is the promise of his coming? Well, the proof that he's about to appear is that rampant prosperity is on the brink of total collapse. They were buying and selling and building and planting until the day. We'll go right up to the end. But it's phony prosperity.
While the US saw positive GDP growth last quarter, and Bernanke called the recession very likely over, consumer spending now accounts for 71% of our GDP compared to the long-term average of 65%. This means our economy is actually weakening underneath the surface. In order for our economy to truly recover, we need to switch from being a nation of consumers to a nation of producers. But in order for the U.S. to once again begin producing goods to export to the rest of the world, We need Americans to increase savings. In late 2008, early 2009, after the U.S. financial markets collapsed, the first instinct of Americans was to start saving. While initially the American savings rate tripled to a high in May of 6.2%, after the government's artificial stimulus took effect, the savings rate plummeted in half back down to 3%. The free market was trying desperately to get our economy headed in the right direction, but the government destroyed any progress that was made. 42% of the phony GDP growth we saw last quarter came from the government's destructive cash for clunkers program.
And so here's a car that people own, that they were driving without any payments. They didn't have car loans on these clunkers. They owned them. Let's destroy that. Let's give you $4,500 to pour acid on the engine so it'll never work. And then we'll pay money to scrap it and all that. Who knows what it costs to actually get rid of each of these working cars. And let's encourage you to go buy a brand new car that you can't afford. And you're going to go into debt to do it. So now, every month, you have to make a car payment that you didn't have before. This is great. This is really how to get out of a recession, right? Shoot it's like we got shot in the arm, and so the solution is, well, let's shoot ourselves in the foot, too.
Cash for clunkers was a Chinese program. Because they would not take our U.S. dollars for their exports. We have to send them a bunch of metal and steel for them to give any type of credit to the U.S. A lot of people don't realize that. That was the brainchild of the Chinese embassy, not the U.S.
So, finally, what will that crash? And it's coming. It's coming, and it will be huge. And we have got to go while it's still prosperous. What will it trigger? Well, we're at Sinai. Many things, brothers and sisters. Middle East peace, that stubborn requirement of Ezekiel 38 that many of us have been waiting for 30, 40 years, overnight. No money. European nations can't support the Palestinians anymore. No money. And Israel will be one of the most prosperous nations on earth. What else? Most nations will abandon their foreign adventures. Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Create a vacuum. Guess who might fill that? Russia stepping in and taking over the power that was once known as the King of the North. An elite group of nations are already emerging in Europe. 10 of them will emerge ultimately, just like the prophecy requires. And Israel will remain relatively unstable, totally independent in oil and gas. What that's telling me is that our days are numbered. How long that will be, I don't know. I might come back, God willing, if health prevails, to see you in 2012. Who knows? But I might see you at some time.